start off like where you were born and the city and the towns around
You
there.
ask me questions.
Go ahead.
Well, I was, as you know, I was born in Lithuania, in an area right near Latvia. We were closer to Riga than the capital of Lithuania, Kaunas. And we were probably about 20 miles away from the Latvian border. In 1939, I think things came to a head because our American family, which of course was my grandmother, and one of my uncles, and no, rather two of my uncles were here, and my aunt.
What were their names, Arthur?
And it was Uncle Harry. Harold was his last name. He had changed it during the First World War. Instead of Herring, he changed his name to Harold.
So Herring was the original name.
Right. So his name ended up being Harry Harold. And my uncle Ben Herring was here. My aunt Rose, who was married to Wolf Beskin, they were here. And my grandmother wouldn't rest until she had her last son safe in America.
And what was her name?
Her name was Kroner Herring. And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
she kept nudging everyone, let's do something, let's move, let's not wait because things are getting kind of risky in Europe. And, you know, with Hitler moving the way he was, the indications were bad.
Can I ask you, I'm going to interrupt you once time. Can you tell a little bit about the history of your family in Lithuania? Do you remember, like, grandparents, and so forth from one?
No, I can say this, that the only one I ended up knowing on my father's side was his mother, who was in America. And on my mother's side, we had our grandfather living.
Do you remember his name?
Oh yes, he lived in Lithuania. His name was Shmuel Hirsch Browdy. And he lived with a younger sister of my mother. And my mother, of course, was not anxious to leave her single, and she was always pushing her to marry the guy next door, who wanted to marry her in the worst way. And instead of leaving her with her older father by themselves, she finally convinced my aunt to accept the guy's proposal. And sure enough, they got married and they had a baby.
There.
In Lithuania.
Yeah, the names were?
I don't quite remember the name of the husband,
yeah,
but he was a next door neighbor who owned a barroom that I remember.
In the town of?
Of Babundik. It was a town that was about probably 40 kilometers from our town of Pandelis. His name, the town that they lived in was Babundik.
Okay.
Oh, Babundikas.
Uh-huh. And what are your first memories when you were young, before you came here?
Well, my memories were such, I went to yeshiva. First I went to Hebrew school in our town. That was the first thing I remember distinctly. I went to a very nice Hebrew school that was instituted by a shul, of course, Orthodox shul. And then I remember going to Rakashik, or in Lithuania it would be Rakashkos.
Was that the name of the town, or was that the name of the
town? It was a town. Rakashik was a town, a larger town than ours, that had a small little yeshiva. So my dad instituted me to go there. He probably thought I'd be a rabbi someday. And I went there for the time being when I was before my bar mitzvah. And then finally I ended up going to a much larger city than Rakashik, what was called Panevėžys. And Panevėžys had a large yeshiva not only for the young, but for people that became rabbis. They were an advanced kind of yeshiva that was able to produce rabbis. As a matter of fact, I had one of the students from the yeshiva who was his last year before becoming a rabbi. He taught me my mafta because I was going to be bar mitzvah while I was in Panevėžys. And you know, in Europe, nobody made a big fuss about bar mitzvah. As a matter of fact, my family never came for my Haftorah reading because it wasn't the style.
Now, was that the school that you went and stayed at? You had mentioned to me you went to a school where you lived there or something.
I lived with a lady, a widow lady, and her daughter. I had a room, and I ate my meals at the yeshiva, my main meal anyway.
And that was how far away from your home?
It was, from our home, it was not, you'd have to take a train. Oh. It was a pretty good distance. It was too far to go by horse and wagon. It would take too long, but there was a train that ran directly to Panevėžys from our town.
And you just stayed there during the week and came home on weekends? Or you
No, I didn't stay. I didn't go home. I stayed there for as long as I was needed to be there, and I just come home. I would go home on vacations, or when we had time off.
What period of time was that?
That's kind of difficult for me to remember when the time was when we left to go home, but we did go home in intervals.
I mean, you stayed there for what, like a month or 2 months?
Oh, more than that. We probably stayed there more than a month.
Really?
At the time. Oh, sure.
And there were a lot of other kids in the school?
Oh, yeah, there was 150 students in the yeshiva that I went to, and 5 rabbis that handled that particular group. And of course, if you went further, you'd go to the advanced yeshivas.
So was that different than the regular school you went to? Did you go to a school?
No, they also had classes. I didn't go to other schools because they also taught language and arithmetic at the yeshiva.
So you learned everything there. Do you remember the name of it? What was the name of the town?
The Panevėžys yeshiva. I don't quite remember what it was called, but I have a feeling it was called the Panevėžys yeshiva.
Yeah.
That's what I think. It's difficult for me to.
Can you remember a little bit what the town looked like that you lived in?
Oh, sure. I remember the town very well. It was quite a little more modernistic town than where we lived where our home was.
No, I mean your home. What did your home look like? What was the hometown look like?
My house?
Yeah, how many people lived in the town?
Well, the people that lived in our town were about 500 Jewish people in our town. We had a couple of shuls, and then we had a Turkish bathhouse where you had to cleanse yourself with a pool.
Because there was no baths in the house.
Well, in your home, the only thing you had, you couldn't really have a shower or a bath the way you do here. I imagine some houses had, but where I lived, they didn't have any facilities for that.
So you went to the Turkish bath.
And if you had to go to the bathroom, you had to go outside in an outhouse. That was the fun.
Yeah.
Real fun. In the winter, it was wonderful.
So they had about 500 people lived there. Right?
500 people lived in our town of Jewish people.
Yeah. And
there could have been a few. In the town itself, there were mostly Jewish people. And in the outskirts of the farms, of course, there were non-Jewish people. So our town was, you would say, with the businesses they had, the clothing stores, the fabric stores, the jeweler, it was mostly Jewish storekeepers.
And your friends? Do you remember any of your friends?
Oh yes, I remember my friends.
Tell us about them. Tell us about them. Do you remember their names?
Well, their names are kind of difficult for, I remember the one distinctly, his name was David, which is David. And the other ones are kind of very hazy. I remember I had pictures of a few. But,
And relatives, how many people in your family? How many people?
well, the relatives were none on my father's side.
Yeah.
We were the only ones that were left of Kroner Herring's family.
They all came to America? Oh, no, they didn't.
We were in Lithuania, as far as I can remember, we were the only Herrings of the family.
Oh, I see. Of your father's family.
Of Mendel Herring, who was Gruner's husband.
Yeah, that was your
My grandparent, but I never met him.
okay.
Mendel Herring, I never met.
What was the other side of the family's name? Do you remember?
Yes, well, Browdy.
Your grandmother's name.
The grandmother's name I don't remember.
What's your mother's name?
I remember the grandfather, because he was alive when I was there. And but as I said, the only ones that were there was one little bit of my mother's family and a little bit of the Herring family, which was us. And in 1939 is when we left.
So then let's talk about that. Who left and
Well,
who stayed?
what happened was,
and the circumstances.
when we came to America, there was my brother Martin, who was the oldest, my sister Frances, who was next, and of course I was the third one, and my sister Marilyn was the fourth one, and
You all came together?
we all came together with my father and mother.
Okay, so tell us a little
Six
bit
of us.
about that leaving when you left and who stayed. I remember you told me a story about, you remember your grandfather coming to see you off.
Well, my grandfather came, my mother's father came to say goodbye to us. It was very sad when he drove out of our courtyard. He drove his horse and wagon in from Babundik to wish us well and to say goodbye to us because he knew we were leaving. And it was such a sad feeling because I had a sort of a inside premonition that I would never see him again. It was a very, very emotional thing.
And that was 1939.
In 1939.
So
That was before the month of May.
tell us about the trip. Tell us about the trip. The trip. So you left Lithuania, and tell us about the trip. Here.
Oh, the trip was very interesting. We left Lithuania. We went to, by train, I remember, and we went through Germany. This is very interesting. My aunt, who had married this man who owned the bar room,
Your aunt who? What was that?
my Aunt Ethel,
Yeah.
who got married before we left, didn't want us to travel to the border or over the border through Germany. Well, he couldn't go to Germany anyway, but he could go with us up to the border
Because why?
because he was afraid that there could be an incident because we were leaving kind of in a little shady way because my brother was army age and he was leaving the country.
But that was Lithuania. What's that got to do with Germany?
Well, in Lithuania, he could have got in trouble because he wasn't supposed to leave without being in the army.
I see.
But once we got over the border in Germany, he was much safer for being accused of not signing up. So he accompanied us to the German border, and then he went back home to his own town, Babundik. And we continued through Germany to Berlin, then Belgium on the same train, and Paris.
And your brother was not with you?
Oh yes, my
Oh,
brother
okay.
was with us, absolutely.
I thought you said he took you to the border and then went back.
No, my brother and we were all together.
Okay.
But there was a very, they thought that if we had an incident where they looked into our visas and saw that maybe somebody would know my brother was older than he really had it in his passport. And that was one of the things that my father was able to accomplish.
So Russia ruled Lithuania at that time. Was the Russian government who ruled?
No, no, it was Lithuania.
Their own government?
Lithuania became independent in 1918. And it was a Lithuanian republic, or I think they were a republic, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But they were independent since 1918.
Okay, so then you got to Paris.
And that was the thing where my father really shined. He made it possible, really, where if you want to call it heroic or you want to call it mazel tov, but he performed something that was very rare. My brother was not able to leave anyway because of his age. He was 20. My brother was 20 years old.
Yeah.
And he would have to serve in the army for 2 years. Now, we couldn't very well leave my brother Martin, and also my mother, who had not relocated her birth certificate. It was lost in the First World War, and she couldn't leave without a certificate. So we couldn't get two people completely free to go, and that began a real story here. This is why I'm talking at the moment with Eugene, because my father really, if he ever did anything at all in his life, that was the best thing he ever did.
So you got, after you got to Paris, or to get you to Paris?
No, that was way before that.
Oh,
While we were still in Lithuania.
Yeah. What did he do?
The American
Your
relative.
father's name was what again? I'm sorry. Your father's
Belville.
name? Belville. Okay, and your mother?
Well, people called him Wolf, but most he was known for Belville.
Okay.
Belville Herring. Well, his middle name is Rachmiel, so it's what really is Rachmiel Zeev Herring. So, but they called him Zeev. Zeev is actually Belville. So what happened was the American family here looked into the possibility of getting us here quicker, because our name, as far as the people allowed to come from Lithuania, like they had a certain amount of people that could come from each country. And we were on the list of a 1946 arrival. Our name was really way up the line. And as far as coming here legally, we would have to wait till 1946. Now this is to 1939, and things look kind of bad in Europe. And of course, my grandmother would not go to sleep without pushing as hard as she could. And sure enough, one of our distant cousins knew the right person to talk to. And whether it was a representative or a senator, I'm not sure.
Your cousin was in Lithuania or in America?
No, in America.
Okay.
Yeah. My distant relative in America, who were Bostonians, were able to get to somebody that moved our name and swapped it with somebody else in 39.
What were those cousins' names? Do you recall? Do you recall their names?
Of
The
who?
cousin?
Oh, the cousins?
Yeah.
Sure, I remember it was Robbins.
And they lived in Boston?
A family in Boston who were able to do this particular feat was the Robbins family. And they, I don't know how difficult it was. They just took our name from the 46
Right.
visas, or don't call them visas. They're on the list anyway of people allowed to come to America.
They had those lists going out that far? They had those lists of You were scheduled to come not until 1946.
We were scheduled, our name was coming up
Can you
to
imagine?
be a American,
Again, my
no, to come to America in 1946.
yeah.
And they just swapped one name to another, and they put us in 1939.
Wasn't that wonderful?
So now we're all set to go, and lo and behold, we have the obstacles of my mother's birth certificate and my brother's army age. So my father was sitting one night in his house, and he jumps up and he says, I think I have a great idea. He just hit me. And he jumps out and he runs to the barn, saddles his horse. Now it was late at night. I mean, not, I would say late at night, it was like maybe 7, 8 o'clock in the evening. And he rides out with his horse and saddle to a farm. Now, before I tell you what happened, I got to go back now to 1914 war, when Germany occupied Lithuania. This is starting from 1914 to 18, somewhere in the middle there. Now I would say it's about, has to be at least almost 30 years. It was 1914, and this is 1939, so it's 25 years, isn't it? Probably 25 years.
Okay, back on.
So, my father at that time was recruited in the Russian army. We're talking about the First World War. He was recruited by the Russians when the Russians were in Lithuania, and he ended up in the Caucasian Mountains for whatever reason, but he developed I think he developed either, he had some kind of either cholera or something. He was sick in the hospital anyway, and he was feeling better, and he must have heard or read that the area where we had our house was occupied by the Germans. And he figured he's better off being in the German occupation than staying in the Caucasian Mountains in the Russian army. So sure enough, he escaped from the hospital, and it's a long way from where he was. And he worked his way back to Lithuania. And that was like a miracle. I don't know how he did it. He wasn't even feeling that great.
How old was he then?
My father was, well, I'd have to go back.
No family at the time. Did he have a family?
I'm not sure whether he was married to my mother at that time. I think he may have been married to my mother, but I'm not 100% sure. I'm trying to figure out if my brother was 20 years old.
In 39, so
He would have been married. I think he was married to my mother at that time, and he got recruited with the Russian army anyway. So he finally worked his way back to Lithuania to our home, our homestead, which at least at that time, he was the third generation, my father. He was my grandfather, my great-grandfather, who I'm named after, Avram Leib Herring. That was my great-grandfather. Then Mendel was my grandfather, and then my dad, Delvin. So I was the fourth generation. So my father was working the following day when he got home. He was trying to fix the shutters in our old house in Lithuania, and he was kind of trimming things up and making it look decent because he hadn't been home for a while. And a German soldier rode up with his horse because the headquarters of the German army was next to our house. It happened to be the church property, and we were just abutting the church property. And in order to get to a certain entrance, they had to go by our house. And when the German officer went by my dad's house, my father turned around and said, "Guten Tag." And of course the officer answered him, "Guten Tag," and then one word led to another word, and before you know it, they started to talk. And the German officer wanted to know why he had not seen him here before. And he explained that he just ran away from the Russian, recruitment. So before the German officer left and said goodbye, he asked my father if he would visit him tomorrow. He'd like to talk to him further. So my dad says, "Okay, where are you?" He says, "I'm in the headquarters through that first gate." So the next day my father went over to see him, and of course he didn't know his name, so he told the guard that the officer he wanted to see rode a certain color horse. "Oh," he says, "you mean the general?" So then my dad realized that he was talking to the general. So he went in to see him anyway, and the general greeted him, made him feel comfortable, told him to sit down, and then he went to the closet, and he took out a pair of German boots that go up to your, way past your knees, and he said to my father, "Wolf," he called him Wolf naturally, he says, "Wolf, try them on. I want to see if they fit you." And my father said he didn't understand why he was doing it, but he tried them on. And they fit him. They were pretty good. He says, "Now that the boots fit you, I'd like to offer you a job." He says, "I need a civilian mayor in this area, like a burgomaster." And he says, "I'm wondering if you would like the position, because I can't allow the civilians to deal with my soldiers. It's not working out well. I got to have a civilian that knows his way around, that speaks languages, and I understand from your background that you speak a few languages, and you'd work out very well."
So during the short time they spoke to each other, he impressed them with...
He impressed them that he knew how to speak Russian, and so on and so on.
Yeah.
So my father thought about it for a moment, and he says, "Well, I haven't made plans what I was going to do, so I guess I could take up your offer." And my father became the burgomaster. Well, needless to say, Gene, when you're in that position, you were able to do a lot of favors for people. You know, people that came to him with troubles, that the German army was, confiscating too much of their livestock. And there were a lot of problems that my dad had to solve. But one particular farmer, who really was a poor farmer, and my father was able to help him when they were trying to take his livestock. He was crying that his family, that he had, 5, 6 kids, and how's he going to support them when they take away so many of his cows and so on, and his horses. So my father went to bat for him, and the German general told him to use his own judgment. Whatever you do is fine. And of course the farmer never forgot my dad. After that, every week when they had a marketplace where the farmers all bought their wares, their vegetables, their dairy products, somebody delivered a package for my dad and mom. Eggs, butter, pressed cheese. They never had to buy anything of that sort.
From this farmer.
Because I was delivered from this farmer every single day when they had
Isn't that a great story?
the sale in the town. And there was a weekly thing.
Mm-hmm.
So this farmer loved my dad beyond words. So lo and behold, this farmer, after 1918, became very wealthy, and he had bought a lot of other land, but he became a very wealthy farmer. And in Lithuania, when a farmer was wealthy and had a lot of income, his children all ended up going to college. And other families that couldn't afford it, those smaller farmers, they just took over the farms from one generation to another.
Were these people Jewish?
No, definitely not. These are all Lithuanians. So there were very few Jewish farmers, really. We had a farm, but that was very unusual. So, Gene, you can imagine this farmer seeing my father at night. And
So we go back to your father. Your father had helped him, and he became Burgermeister, and the years went by.
my father was the Burgermeister. That's years ago.
Yes.
20 or 25 years earlier. This farmer never forgot it. And that's why my dad knew the farmer's background, and he knew how the farmer could help him. What had happened when the farmer became a wealthy farmer later on after Lithuania became independent, he sent his children to college, and one of his sons became a minister in the government. And my dad knew it. Now, here's a situation where he knows the man well, and his son is a minister in the government. Who are you going to help? This isn't something you can buy for money. Number one, we didn't have any money. But this is something that someone would either do it for you or not, because these kind of things you just can't be done.
So your father was racking his brain trying to figure out what to do.
How to overcome the problem with my son's army thing.
And a light bulb went off.
And the light went off. That's right. A bulb went off.
Yeah.
So anyway, the farmer looked at my dad. He says,
So he got on his horse and
he rode out to see him at night. And the farmer said, "Ponas Veltkas, what do you do?" He called them Veltkas, like Melville. They just added on an A as Veltkas. He called him and says, "Ponas Veltkas, what are you doing out here?" My father says, "Well, I came to see you. I need you. You're probably the only one that can help me." And the farmer says, "Oh, did I hear you say I can help you?" And he lifted his eyes to the sky. He says, "Thank you, Lord, for sending this man down."
Really? Isn't that something?
That's
a great story.
That's how happy he was to hear that my father needed him. So my dad told him that he really needed his son's help. And needless to say, the farmer wrote a letter to his son. And the next day, my father was on a train to the capital of Lithuania to deliver a personal letter from his father to the son. And when the son read the letter, he didn't say one single word. He said, "You will hear from me within 3 weeks." And he left him all the information about my mother's not having a birth certificate and my brother's age. And whatever he needed to leave, he left it with him. Sure enough, 3 weeks later, or within 3 weeks, arrived a package from the government. My brother was now 2 years younger with a new birth certificate, and my mother had a brand new birth certificate of her own.
That's a great story.
And we were on the way.
Isn't that a great story?
So that's what really solved that big problem. And when my uncle went with us to the German border, that was only the protection in case we ran into a problem with the Lithuanian government. Because we are doing something that is a little bit, not what you call kosher. So then once we got into Germany, it was clear sailing because we went through Germany. We had a few incidents on the train, which wasn't too pleasant.
Yeah.
We had an incident on the train in Lithuania, too. And it's a good thing my uncle was there.
Tell us.
That incident with my uncle was unbelievable. Of course, you realize that he used to bounce out drunks from his bar room. So he was a pretty strong, rugged guy. My brother Martin was on the way to the bathroom, and there were soldiers in in the corridor on the train, the way those trains were built, they had compartments in their walkway. So when Martin went to the bathroom, they were sort of teasing around with him. They said, "How would you like to fly through the window while the train is going? You could be a bird." And they picked him up. They were going to fling him through the window. And my father saw what was going on. He jumped up. He was going to run out to protect him. My uncle said, "Sit down. Don't move. I'll handle it." And he went out to into the corridor, and he says, "Hi, fellas." And he put his arms around each one of these guys. And before you know it, their heads hit together. He hit like two balls. He whacked them together.
Really?
And pretty soon they're lying on the ground, out cold.
Really?
So the conductor comes around and says, "What's going on here?" My uncle says, "I don't know what's going on here, but these people are drunk. They fell on the floor here." So that was the incident as far as Lithuania. But then we had an incident in Germany where we were sitting in a compartment, and a nice German woman opened our compartment, and she says, "Is it possible that you could spare one seat?" And my father said in German, "Of course. We'll just tighten up a little bit. We'll make room for you." And because we were 6, and we made room for her to be able to sit because it was very crowded. And the trains were full of soldiers, and the roads were full of mobilized trucks and tanks. It was like an unbelievable scene when you looked out of the window.
Now, war had broken out. I mean, that was
That was
39.
they're waiting for the Second World War.
Yeah, so Poland, the war.
That was before it was actually a month, it was, hold on one second.
Yeah.
It was probably either a month or 2 months before Hitler marched on Poland.
I see.
Because we came to America on Memorial Day, May 30th.
Okay.
So this had to be a couple of months before.
I see. But all the stuff, you knew about all the stuff that was going on in Germany?
Oh, my dad knew he was well informed.
And
He knew, he read papers and he read newspapers continually.
Yeah.
And he knew what was going on in the world. He really understood he says to my mother, "There's going to be a disaster." Yeah. My dad knew when he saw the movement of arms that he said that I'm afraid there's going to be a world disaster.
And Nuremberg laws and all the Kristallnacht and all that had happened already,
I think that had happened while we were still in Lithuania.
Yeah, so.
The only thing that didn't happen happened after we left was the German march on Poland.
Right, they invited Poland.
And this Kristallnacht, I'm not sure whether that went on just before that. Perhaps we were in America, I'm not sure.
Okay,
I shouldn't have waited that long to tell you the story.
No.
I forgot a lot of it. So we went through Germany into Belgium, and we stayed in Paris waiting for our ship to take us to America.
How long was that?
We were probably at least a week. And then we went to Cherbourg, France, and we boarded the Aquitania, which was the English Canal Line. Because we were actually traveling under the English Canal Line protection.
Okay.
All our papers said Canal Line, so that we wouldn't be like refugees from Lithuania.
I see.
We came by law legally as far as going to America, and we were traveling legally through all these countries with our papers saying that we were Canal Line passengers.
So you got all your tickets and everything while you were in Lithuania?
Oh yes, everything. Our eyes were examined by an eye doctor, and the eye doctor was he wasn't like envious, but he said to my dad, when he was signing all these papers for us, he says, if I could have your papers for America, you know what I would leave you? I'd leave you everything, including my underwear.
Oh my God.
He said, if I could take your papers for my family right now, you could have whatever I own in the world. My hospital, my beach houses, all my money, all my jewelry.
So people were desperate to get
To leave at that time with our papers from America.
Yeah, gold. It was like gold.
Better, it was platinum.
So you were in Paris and you stayed there for a week.
So we stayed in Paris. We had to walk 5 flights to our room because there was no elevator there. But we were poor, so that was okay. But we left on the Canard Line, and of course, yours truly gets terribly seasick. So I slept on top of the deck on a bench.
Yeah.
I wouldn't go down below. When I went down below where our room was, I would get so nauseous I'd get sick. So I used to sleep. I took a little pillow and I'd sleep on a bench on the deck.
With a lot of people on the boat.
Oh yes, the Canard Line, this Equitania was a big ship.
It's interesting because it was before, you say probably before World War II broke out, before the Germans invaded Poland. So there wasn't a lot of, I know after the war, after declared war, England declared war, there was a lot of activity in the Atlantic at that time with even civilian ships. So you were right before that happened, I think. Is that what you said? I forget. Didn't they invade September of '39? I think they invaded in September.
They invaded in September. We came in Memorial Day.
There you go.
June, July, August, 3 months.
Yeah. So you're right
We
before.
were here 3 months. So whether in these 3 months other things, incidents happen, I'm not, but we're talking about crystal meth.
Yeah.
It could have happened in these 3 months
I think it happened.
while we're here. I'm not sure.
We'll check it in our.
Yeah, we can
I
check
think it was
it out.
before.
But we were on the way to America. That was the greatest thing my dad ever performed. I know he was a beekeeper.
Yeah, yeah.
And he was a good beekeeper. He really was. He knew. He was raising bees he was buddies with the priest next door, the Catholic priest.
Oh, in the church next door to your house.
The church next door to my house, the priest was extremely fond of my dad, and they both had bees. And my father used to help him with his beekeeping whenever he had trouble. And the priest every Sunday would end his sermon, I want you people to go home and have a good week and get along with each other like my neighbor, Mr. Herring, and I got along.
Isn't that nice?
That's right,
Was that a Catholic church?
Catholic church.
And then, so your father was a smart man, obviously.
My father knew the people in the surrounding areas that my father dealt with, they loved him. They thought my father was, they could find anything for him.
Self-taught. What was his education?
My father he was mostly self-taught as far as languages.
Yeah.
All the languages he knew, which was 7. I couldn't understand how he could keep track of them.
That's not.
He spoke German fluently. Because one of the reasons he spoke German fluently, because when my grandmother had a hardware store, ran a hardware store in Lithuania, my father used to go to Königsberg to buy hardware. So he learned how to speak German because he was dealing with Germans.
And he spoke German, Lithuanian,
Russian, Lithuanian,
Yiddish,
Latvian, Polish. So let's see, Polish, Russian, Lithuanian, Latvian, German is 5, Jewish is 6,
Yeah.
Hebrew is 7.
What did you speak in the house?
Jewish.
Spoke Yiddish. Yeah.
Well, my dad and mother had company. They spoke Russian. Because Russian was the in language, and people, when they wanted to talk about things so the children wouldn't understand, they spoke Russian.
It's like people who were, like my parents didn't want to understand, they spoke a little Yiddish, so
Yeah.
we wouldn't understand.
No, but in Lithuania, the style was like people with any kind of understanding, they spoke Russian.
I see. Interesting.
In my house, we spoke Jewish between ourselves, but Yiddish. But when company came, I could tell they switched on and talked Russian.
We are That was end of part one. We're going on to part two.
What did I say at the end? I didn't hear it.